listeners. Welcome to the 23rd lecture in this NPTEL course, which focuses on the 20th century English novel as it is manifested in the work of a selected group of women novelists. I will wrap up our discussion of Nightwood very quickly, introduce a couple of ideas that will help you understand Nightwood, and then move on to the next novelist and book in our course, which is the novel Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. So, as I mentioned in the previous lectures, the first 4 chapters of Nightwood do a pretty good job of introducing all of the major characters, the people between whom dynamics will change, and the story of the evolution of the dynamics between whom the novel is a chronicle. Chapter 4 introduces Jenny Petherbridge, and I just want to take a few minutes to read from the opening pages of this chapter and end with a very unique and somewhat strange description of Jenny. This chapter is titled The Squatter, and we're told that Jenny Petherbridge was a widow, a middle-aged woman who had been married 4 times. And then the narrator tells us each husband had wasted away and died. She had been like a squirrel racing a wheel day and night in an endeavor to make them historical. They could not survive it. And after this, we get a description of Jenny, which again, continuing the novel's preoccupation with the continuity between human and extra-human, or human and other forms of life, which are traditionally associated with stationary or vegetal forms, but are actually found to be blurring with the human. And we have seen this in the way the narrator introduces Robin Vote, the way the narrator introduces Nora, and we see that again as this third woman is introduced. Again, we see descriptions of this woman's figure, of this woman's body, which are inspired and which use metaphors and images from the natural world. I'm going to read first and then comment on it. The narrator tells us that she, that is Jenny, had a beaked head and the body small, feeble, and ferocious that somehow made one associate her with Judy. They did not go together, only severed could any part of her have been called right. There was a trembling ardor in her wrists and fingers, as if she were suffering from some elaborate denial. She looked old, yet expectant of age. She seemed to be steaming in the vapors of someone else about to die. Still she gave off an odor to the mind, for there are purely mental smells that have no reality, of a woman about to be accouchée. And then further, the narrator tells us, her body suffered from its fare, laughter and crumbs, abuse and indulgence, but put out a hand to touch her, and her head moved perceptibly with the broken arc of 2 instincts, recoil and advance, so that the head rocked timidly and aggressively at the same moment, giving her a slightly shuddering and expectant rhythm. Now, what we can make out from this description is a richly associated set of metaphors. The description seems to jump from different registers and seems to combine a lot of different images taken from a lot of different contexts, from the natural world, from medical terminology, from the discourse of medicine and illness. And we have seen several of these things prefigured earlier in the novel as well. There was that description in which the doctor self-diagnosed his neurasthenia as a case of impatience. And here also we see another possibly undiagnosed patient of neurasthenia. Neurasthenia, as I mentioned earlier, was an early 20th century term used to describe a sort of mystery illness, ghostly phantom aches and pains in different limbs which did not seem to have any obvious cause. But more than that, we see this person who seems to be almost at the mercy of stimuli from outside her individual body. And being at the mercy of these external stimuli has reduced this person to a state of almost permanent anxiety, nervousness, and trembling. I will end this description by mentioning something that the narrator uses to describe and give readers an impression of who Jenny is. And the impression that we get of Jenny is someone who is interested in a lot of things, who wants to understand and empathize with a lot of other people, other cultures, other narratives. And this impulse, while sincere, doesn't actually do her any good. And I will say a little more about this later, but I want to preface this description by saying that we can read in this moment a way in which the writer, Djuna Barnes, takes a very old idea that governs the discussion of aesthetics in Western and especially English literature. The idea is that of reception, being susceptible and being open to the influence of other literatures. And specifically, I have referred in the previous lecture to T.S. Eliot's idea of tradition and the individual talent. We discussed how, in the case of the Baron Felix, the impulse, a very sincere one, to internalize the mind of Europe produced a very negative consequence. In this case also, in the case of Jenny's character, we see how we can understand that Jenny might be implementing unconsciously a Keatsian idea of negative capability. But while in Keats and Eliot and other advocates of this kind of aesthetics of reception, all the way to Harold Bloom's idea of the anxiety of influence, in all of these poets, scholars who also happen to be male, this reception or this impulse to internalize, understand, obediently consume the canonical art and culture of Europe is a good thing. In this novel by Djuna Barnes, that impulse is seen in a very suspicious way. It does not produce any obviously or any tangibly positive results. And in fact, the only consequences it has are quite negative. And that's what happens here in the case of Jenny Petherbridge as well. We are told that she sent books, that she was interested in books, and the narrator tells us that she would smile, toss her hands up, widen her eyes. Immediately, everyone in the room had a certain feeling of something lost, sensing that there was one person who was missing the importance of the moment, who had not heard the story, the teller herself. And we are told that she had endless cuttings and scraps from journals and old theatre programs. She haunted the Comédie Française, spoke of Molière, Racine, and La Dame aux Camélias, that is, steeped in the very prestigious and elite cultural context of French culture. To men, she sent books by the dozen. The general feeling was that she was a well-read woman, though she had read perhaps 10 books in her life. And then we get this key passage describing Jenny. The narrator tells us that she, Jenny, had a continual rapacity for other people's facts. Absorbing time, she held herself responsible for historic characters. She was avid and disorderly in her heart. She defiled the very meaning of personality in her passion to be a person. Somewhere about her was the tension of the accident that made the beast the human endeavor. She was nervous about the future. It made her indelicate. And it is this contradiction that I want to unpack a little bit. What is happening here? In a way, Jenny is a perfectly good student. Jenny is a very obedient A+ type student. If conducting oneself in society, conducting oneself with other people, means that one should pay attention, if one should give oneself up, if one should efface oneself and dedicate oneself to the task of understanding others, which is not limited to merely a cognitive or intellectual activity, but requires a deep effacement of oneself. If that is what it means to be a good student of life, then Jenny is in fact a good student, but that is all she is unfortunately confined to be. She fails to become a good person. If the idea of empathy and self effacement, if the intention of these very noble things is to become successful as an individual, then in Jenny's case, the means do not lead to the end, right? Jenny is limited to the instruments of self effacement and does not get any of the consequences of such effacement. And that leads the narrator to a great suspicion about what these means are supposed to do in the first place. Ultimately, it's a suspicion directed at these very sacred, almost holy cows of Western literary aesthetics. Should one really be empathetic? And the word empathy is given a very high value and is presented as a literary and aesthetic value worth striving for in the work of the Victorian novelist George Eliot. Further, I've already mentioned John Keats and T.S. Eliot. So there are a lot of these sacred holy cows in English literary studies, and all of these are viewed with a great deal of suspicion. And it's because of this impulse to be preoccupied and obsessed with the lives of other people, the stories written by other people. It makes Jenny a particular type of person, not a very likable or very impressive person. In fact, the narrator labels her a squatter because intellectually and spiritually, the life of mind that Jenny has cultivated can be described as the mental equivalent of squatting. So just like someone squats in someone else's property or space, mentally speaking, Jenny has been squatting in someone else's intellectual space. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? That is a different question, because and that you'll have to read the novel to know more about. But I'll just read one last quote from this and move on. The narrator tells us, "No one could intrude upon her because there was no place for intrusion. This inadequacy made her insubordinate. She could not participate in a great love. She could only report it. Since her emotional reactions were without distinction, she had to fall back on the emotions of the past. Great loves already lived and related, and over those she seemed to suffer and grow glad. When she fell in love, it was with the perfect fury of accumulated dishonesty. She became instantly a dealer in second-hand and therefore incalculable emotions. As from the solid archives of usage she had stolen or appropriated the dignity of speech, so she appropriated the most passionate love that she knew, Nora's for Robin. She was a squatter by instinct." So I'll stop with reading from Nightwood here, but this seems to be a perfectly apt and very powerfully suggestive moment. So you can see how the novel introduces a triangle. The novelist Jeanette Winterson calls it an impossible triangle. But there is a triangle within a triangle, because the triangle, traditionally speaking, involves a complication of romantic feelings between two people, and the complication happens because a third person is introduced with romantic feelings for one of the first two. While this happens, there are three, that's Nora, Robin, and Jenny. There is a further complication because the nature of Jenny's romantic feelings for either Nora and Robin are not clear. It's not clear because we are asked to think about the extent to which these feelings are less individual sensations or feelings that emerge from Jenny's experience and more of things that Jenny may have gathered from the many stories and the many people whose lives she has been familiar with and in whose lives she has been studying herself into as a participant and as someone who understands. So the triangle within the triangle is about the kinds of feelings Jenny develops and to what extent they are real. Their reality, to what extent their reality comes from Jenny's reading, from Jenny's understanding, from Jenny's social intercourse as a person who lives in a particular class, who inhabits a certain social context, and to what extent they emerge from her personal feelings for these two individuals. And this leads the narrator to describe Jenny as a squatter by instinct. I'll stop with the textual discussion of Nightwood here, but before I move on to the next writer and novel in our course, I want to briefly share an idea that I came across recently while researching this text and associated literary context. This idea is titled Modernism at Night, and it is actually the title of an essay published by Heather Love in 2009, a special issue of the journal PMLA, which is the special issue is on the theme queer modernism. Heather Love, the scholar, argues that in the early decades of the 21st century, there's been quite a bit of work that seeks to expand modernism from its very canonical British literary origins and to define modernism from the perspective of quite a wide variety of cultural and social developments that were taking place at the same time, at the same historical moment that, say, T.S. Eliot and James Joyce and Virginia Woolf were writing their very canonical works. Now, given the range of scholarship that's been published on the topic, Heather argues that it does not make sense to think about modernism simply as limited to Europe or England. In fact, the way modernism has been redefined continually and repeatedly using both geographical, historical, as well as identity-based, as well as theory-based categories, and a list of modernistic definitions include queer modernism, feminist modernism, African American modernism, post-colonial modernism, and so many others. It seems that modernism itself was all of these things, and that each of these things are not secondary to modernism, but modernism itself is defined by each of these different variants. And so in that sense, we can see how Nightwood, the novel by Djuna Barnes, very perfectly and very powerfully anticipates that idea. Although the novel itself does not concern post-colonial, third world, or geographically any distinct characters, it describes a sort of alienation, a sort of detachment that affects each of these individuals who, in their own small and less obvious ways, are quite critical of the European modernity, which was in equal parts a function of capitalism and heteronormativity. So the idea that Heather Love puts forward is that queerness has always been a part of modernism, and queerness does not merely refer to gay or lesbian identities. We can see very powerfully how Nightwood by Djuna Barnes helps us understand the essential alienation, the essential isolation of every individual, which modernism helps us unpack and helps us appreciate as a defining condition of modernity. So I encourage you all to read Heather Love's essay on modernism at night and to think about how Nightwood anticipates many of the different ways in which modern literary movements, including post-colonial and contemporary Anglophone writing, how each of these writings did not emerge by challenging canonical or British modernity, but how canonical or British modernity in itself had the potential for these suspicious gazes to be directed at itself. Okay, now I'll move on to the work of Zora Neale Hurston. some of you may have heard of Hurston, and for some of you, the name may be new. The name used to be new to a lot of scholars in the late 20th century because Hurston was dismissed and not really championed by a lot of cultural luminaries in the African American literary context. And the reasons for that I'll make very clear. They have to do with the way Hurston engages with conservatism inherent in the vernacular and folk lives of African American communities. But before I introduce any of those theoretical and literary contexts, I want to talk briefly about connection to contemporary popular culture, which I came across recently. Just this past weekend, I was watching a stand-up comedy special by the Japanese-American stand-up comedian Atsuko Okatsuka, who writes in her special Intruder. She makes a joke about gluten allergies. And Okatsuka's point is that she recently discovered that her grandmother, who's Japanese, had become allergic to gluten. And this shocked her and caused her a great deal of disturbance because she could not believe, or found it very difficult to believe, that it was something that could happen to immigrants. And gluten allergies is something that Okatsuka thought only happened to white people because white people were still evolving. That is, white people, in the context of this joke, were at an earlier stage, were at a somewhat more primitive stage of evolution than Japanese or people of other ethnicity. And the point of this joke is that it is recalling those historical moments in which this very idea of primitivism was projected onto other ethnicities by several individuals who were white. So this is a joke that, to use the language of stand-up comedy, punches up. It does not punch down, but theoretically, while punching up, it carries the seed of what has proved to be an extremely pervasive idea. And the idea is that evolution can be linked to a particular category of human identity. Evolution can be projected onto different categories of human identity, and it can be possible to see how different human beings who belong to different ethnicities might belong to different stages in the evolution of the human being as a species. Except that here, Okatsuka has reversed the idea and made it funny. Earlier in the 20th century, with eugenics, this was quite tragic. It was not funny, but in fact led to a great deal of violence. I find that idea, and I find the reference, and I find this joke from a 21st century Asian American female stand-up comic quite pertinent to our discussion of an early 20th century, and the time gap is almost 100 years between the kind of writing we will encounter in Their Eyes Were Watching God and the joke that I just referred to. It's almost close to 100 years. But I find it quite pertinent despite this century-long separation, because the intellectual power in Zora Neale Hurston's writing emerges from her deep, sincere, and almost lifelong engagement with things like folklore, hoodoo, voodoo, magic, and many aspects of poor vernacular African American life in the American South as well as in the Caribbean. Aspects of Black vernacular life which were dismissed by many contemporary anthropologists as remnants of primitivism. So Zora Neale Hurston very powerfully retrieves these remnants of so-called primitivism and was continually striving to find a way to describe and write about these practices in a way that would not identify these practices as remnants of primitivism, but rather to think about them as a part of an ongoing struggle that the African American community had developed, given the history of 19th and 20th centuries in America. And one contemporary scholar uses the expression that in Zora Neale Hurston's writing about Black vernacular and Black folklore, we find an awareness of the ubiquity of malice. Malice is ubiquitous because of the way American societies, the way America, the way the United States as a nation continued to evolve, and the way that nation treated Black bodies, and in some ways continues to treat Black bodies. This ubiquity of malice requires a particular tenacity, requires a particular moral strength. And it is in order to develop that tenacity and that moral strength that Black folklore comes up with things that might appear primitive. So this, in a nutshell, is what we can say about Zora Neale Hurston's development of this approach and her interest. And to continue the metaphor from Djuna Barnes, there is a suspicion here as well of the idea of being a blank slate or remaining negatively capable. Anthropologists of Hurston's time were more of blank slates, and Hurston strives to be more critical, more intelligent, much more aware, much more empathetic, and much more ethical of a blank slate, to write about the people and the practices who lived in abject poverty in the American South and developed all of these stories and narratives in order to negotiate their life around this ubiquitous malice that described 20th century American treatment of Black bodies. So, to move to somewhat factual biographical introduction, I'm going to use this source, which is a short essay by Arlisha Norwood, a 2017 fellow of the U.S. National Women's History Museum, who has done some very important historical work to provide us with these facts. Zora Hurston is, of course, an icon and an undeniable force in Black literary culture, and not just Black, but women's writing of the 20th century. But it's important to note that in a lot of scholarly and critical sources, some of the facts of Hurston's life are incorrect or incomplete. Norwood identifies for us what seemed to be, as of today, authoritative and factually correct information, which is that Zora Neale Hurston was born in Notasulga, Alabama on January 7th, 1891. Now, this fact of her birth in Alabama and in the year 1891 is a bit different from what you may find in other sources. And even quite reputable sources, even quite reputed university presses have managed to get the fact wrong, because at different stages, Hurston used different information. So one information that can be found in a lot of sources, especially if they were published in the late 20th century, is that Hurston was born in Eatonville, Florida in 1901. That is something that Hurston herself claimed at different stages, but the correct and most up-to-date information is that Hurston was born not in Florida, but in Alabama, and in the year 1891, not 1901. Those two facts, the time and place of 1901 Eatonville, Florida, are actually very important, which we will learn later, and they become especially more important when we read the novel Their Eyes Were Watching God. I'll talk more about Hurston's life and the novel in the next lecture. Thank you.